They say you are what you eat, but what if what you eat ends up finishing you? Welcome back to Last Moments. Today I'm sharing 6 stories where ordinary meals ended in extraordinary tragedy. From frozen grape jelly lunches in Osaka to a boiled egg that became the center of attention at a Christmas party, ending in a way no one saw coming. It was July 8th, 2016 in Osaka, Japan. The cramped city neighborhood was packed with concrete apartment blocks and narrow streets. It was right before summer break, and the campus courtyard was crowded at lunch. In the middle of all that was 21-year-old Zenjiro Murata. Most people just called him Zen, and honestly, he sounded like a genuinely good kid. He was quiet, polite, and a total tech nerd who loved fixing up old radios with his granddad. Zen was just one of those guys who had to take everything apart to figure out how it ticked. He was part of his college robotics club, often staying up late to help build a sensor arm for an upcoming competition. But despite being smart, Zen had one stubborn habit. He loved frozen grape konjac jelly. His mom constantly warned him about the choking labels, but he never listened. Sometimes, no matter how old we get, we always think we're too smart to listen to our moms. That morning, he packed 2 frozen jelly cups in his bag. By lunch, they were still rock hard in the center. Security footage later showed him sitting outside with friends, talking about the robotics competition on what appeared to be a completely ordinary day. But around 12:37, Zen peeled the lid off one of the jellies. Instead of squeezing it out in small, manageable bites, he tilted the cup back and sucked it down hard. Witnesses said he was totally joking around, trying to swallow the whole thing in one shot. And that silly joke changed everything in a second. The jelly broke loose and slid straight into his throat, almost completely intact. At first, his friends thought he was joking. Then his hands shot to his throat. The frozen jelly had become lodged in his airway. He tried to cough, but only a faint clicking sound came out. Everyone could see something was terribly wrong, but nobody could fix it. A supervisor rushed over and started the Heimlich maneuver, while a nurse called 911, but the frozen jelly stayed firmly in place. By the time paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, Zen was already in severe distress and struggling to breathe. When Zen arrived at the hospital, doctors immediately focused on securing his airway. The challenge wasn't that they kept making unsuccessful attempts to grab the jelly. The real problem was that the frozen mass was tightly wedged in place and difficult to remove without causing further blockage. Every minute that passed meant less oxygen reaching his brain. Doctors eventually succeeded in removing the obstruction, but by then Zen had already experienced a prolonged period of oxygen deprivation. His heart went into cardiac arrest shortly afterward. Medical staff worked desperately to restore circulation and stabilize him. Although they were able to restart his heart, the lack of oxygen had caused catastrophic brain injury. Zen never regained consciousness. He died 2 days later, surrounded by his family. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as complications from asphyxiation caused by airway obstruction. Investigators noted that freezing the jelly had likely contributed to the tragedy by making it firm enough to remain intact rather than breaking apart when it became lodged in his throat. In the aftermath, the campus banned frozen jelly cups entirely. It's an incredibly heavy story, but there is one small, bittersweet detail left to share. Zen's robotics club went ahead and finished building his sensor arm, entering it into the competition under his name. It was a quiet tribute to a bright guy who lost his life to something so ordinary. Half a world away from Zen's robotics workshop, another young man's story would also begin with something small, harmless, and impossible to take back. It was April 12th, 2014, over in Cagliari, Sardinia. The summer evening air carried the smell of grilled seafood and wine from all the outdoor tables overlooking the harbor. The waterfront was packed with tourists, and local musicians were playing nearby. And it felt like the perfect summer night, the kind of evening you remember for all the right reasons. In the middle of that crowd was 28-year-old Montgomery Monty Lopez, an Australian travel photographer documenting traditional foods across Europe. Monty was adventurous, outgoing, and always hunting for the wildest experiences. That drive is what makes a great creator. That night, a local guide invited him to a private gathering outside the city featuring Casu Marzu, a controversial Sardinian cheese containing live insect larvae. When the cheese wheel was opened, several guests stepped back because the inside was literally moving. Hundreds of tiny white maggots were squirming through the soft cheese, and some were so active they were launching themselves several inches into the air, Locals were actually shielding their eyes while serving it. Monty was fascinated. He spent nearly 20 minutes filming close-up footage, joking that the food looked alive because, technically, it was. Now, this is where the story gets frustrating. One older guest explicitly warned him not to eat it, explaining that if the larvae appeared unhealthy or the cheese had been stored incorrectly, dangerous bacteria could grow inside. Another guest even said they should throw the whole wheel away because it looked way too old. But Monty just brushed off the warnings and came up with what he thought was a smart fix. Using a knife, he carefully scraped away the visible larvae from his portion, laughing that if the maggots were the problem, you just had to remove them. It's wild how common sense can completely fail you when you don't know the whole story. What Monty didn't get was that the danger wasn't the insects, it was the invisible bacteria already contaminating the cheese. He ate several large pieces and felt completely fine for the rest of the night. But by the next afternoon, severe stomach cramps hit him out of nowhere, followed by violent vomiting and a high fever. His friends figured it was just basic food poisoning and told him to rest. By the second day, he couldn't even stand. He was completely dehydrated and confused, and when he finally got to the ER, doctors immediately knew it was a massive bacterial infection. The bacteria had leaked into his bloodstream, spreading through his entire body. Doctors flooded him with antibiotics, but his blood pressure suddenly crashed, and his organs began shutting down. He had gone into septic shock. Monty was rushed to the ICU on life support while his family flew in from Australia, but the damage was irreversible. 4 days after eating the cheese, Monty passed away. Following Monty's death, local health authorities investigated the gathering and examined the remaining cheese. Officials concluded that the wheel had likely been improperly stored, allowing dangerous bacteria to grow. Because the event was informal and there was no evidence anyone knowingly served contaminated food, no criminal charges were filed. What bothers me most is that Monty thought he had solved the problem. He removed the visible larvae, never realizing the real danger was the bacteria he couldn't see. One mistake cost him his life. The next story shows that danger doesn't always come from something exotic. Sometimes it's just 12 wings and a cash prize. It was October 5th, 2013, inside a packed sports bar on the outskirts of Tampa, Florida. The place was loud and cramped, with every TV blasting a different game and the smell of fried food hanging thick in the air. A small stage had been set up near the bar, and a crowd had gathered around it, phones out and recording. To kill time before his shift, 27-year-old Stephen Penner was hanging around the bar with a few coworkers. Stephen was a low-key warehouse worker who'd spent years quietly saving up for a down payment on a used truck. He was a quiet, intensely focused guy who never cared about being the center of attention. The only reason he was even there that night was that his coworkers wouldn't stop hyping up the bar's infamous wing challenge. His main goal was the cash prize, which for him was basically the difference between waiting another 6 months for that truck and driving off the lot that weekend. Stephen wasn't a big spice guy, but he figured he could push through anything for a few $100. Winning that prize meant everything to him. The challenge was simple on paper. 12 wings coated in a house blend built around ghost pepper and habanero extract, eaten within 10 minutes. But for me, this was already a total recipe for disaster. The bar had posted standard waivers and warnings, but let's be real, the staff treated the whole thing like a fun gimmick night and nothing more. And look, I get why people line up for these things. The crowd was buzzing, people were cheering, and the bartender had a stopwatch ready. There was zero medical staff on site, just a manager filming for the bar's social media and a stack of napkins on standby. Stephen started off strong, but by wing number 8, the heat had completely taken over. His eyes were watering, his face was bright red, and he was visibly struggling. Witnesses said he was gagging between bites but kept shoving wings into his mouth, barely chewing, just trying to beat the clock. Right after he finished the 12th wing, Stephen threw his hands up to celebrate, but within seconds, his body completely rejected it, and he doubled over, vomiting onto the floor. Then came the absolute worst part. In the middle of throwing up, he took a sharp, sudden gasp of air. That breath pulled the vomit, along with a small chunk of wing bone he hadn't fully cleared, straight down into his windpipe. Witnesses on the cell phone video heard a horrible, wet, choking sound before he dropped to one knee. Honestly, it completely blows my mind that for a second, everyone around him actually assumed he was sweating it out or overwhelmed by the heat, until his pale face went and collapsed flat on the floor. Emergency service were called, and when paramedics came, they used a suction tool, but the bone fragment and stomach contents were packed deep in his airway, completely blocking his breathing. Stephen went into cardiac arrest right there on the bar floor. The medical examiner ruled the death an asphyxiation caused by airway obstruction and aspiration of food material. The The report noted that the wing bone had become wedged in a way that made it difficult to clear on his own. Afterward, the bar permanently canceled the wing challenge. Stephen's family asked that the prize money be donated to a local trade school scholarship fund in his name. I still think about how Stephen's family turned that cash prize into a scholarship, but the next story proves that even something as simple as a scoop of ice cream can turn into a fight for your last breath. It was September 14th, 2017, inside a busy downtown ice cream shop in Knoxville, Tennessee. Families and college students were winding down their evening at the tables. Behind the counter, employees prepped orders and gossiped about a viral, dangerously spicy challenge. Nobody knew how fast things would fall apart. After finishing a routine shift at his part-time job, 23-year-old Thayer Collins dropped by the shop with two co-workers. Thayer was a community college student working toward his HVAC certification. I respect that kind of drive. It wasn't a glamorous path, but Thayer loved hands-on work. He just wanted a stable career in a place of his own. He was a quiet, dependable guy who usually hated being the center of attention. He had mild asthma, but it was totally under control. That evening, he only agreed to the challenge because his co-worker started teasing him. We've all been there, pushing our luck just because a friend egged us on. The shop had just rolled out the Reaper Scoop, a vanilla ice cream loaded with concentrated Carolina Reaper pepper extract. If you finished it in under 5 minutes, you got a free t-shirt and your photo of the Wall of Fame. The staff warned contestants about burning, cramps, and vomiting. Because so many people had done it without a real disaster, everyone assumed it was ultimately harmless. It's crazy how easily we ignore warnings when we see everyone else doing it. Thayer sat down while his buddy started recording. As the pepper extract melted, the burn set in. Witnesses said Thayer was wiping tears and shaking his head as the heat built. His face turned bright red, but he kept eating. I can't imagine enduring that kind of pain for a t-shirt. At 4 minutes, he finished the scoop. He was chugging water and joking around. Then, suddenly, he leaned way forward. Security footage showed Thayer gripping the table before throwing up on the floor. Now, I know vomiting after a spicy challenge isn't a total shocker, but Thayer couldn't stop. Witnesses described it as incredibly forceful, repeated retching. During one awful moment, while desperately trying to catch his breath, he took a sudden, sharp inhale. That single breath pulled the liquid vomit right down into his airway. Thayer doubled over, coughing violently and clutching his chest. Within minutes, it became terrifyingly obvious that something was seriously wrong. He could barely gasp, and a wet, crackling sound came from his chest. Seeing his lips turn blue, his coworker finally dialed 911. The ambulance arrived minutes later. Finding Thayer in severe respiratory distress, paramedics hooked him up to oxygen and rushed him to the ER. Doctors realized Thayer had aspirated vomit into his lungs. To put it plainly, stomach fluid had gone down the wrong pipe. That highly acidic fluid caused immediate severe damage to his lung tissue, and his asthma likely flared up from the shock. Thayer's condition worsened overnight. His lungs became so inflamed that he needed a ventilator, but he died 2 days later from respiratory failure. The medical examiner ruled that he died from complications caused by aspirating gastric contents. The shop permanently ended the challenge. Just weeks from graduation, Thayer was later awarded a posthumous certificate, while the local food blogger who inspired the challenge quietly deleted the original video. While Thayer's story ended at work, the next tragedy unfolded before a much smaller crowd in Batangas, where a celebration turned deadly in seconds. It was December 15th, 2018, in the small community of Santa Cruz in Batangas, Philippines. The covered basketball court was packed before sunset. Christmas lights hung from the rafters above stacks of raffle prizes, while music blasted from rented speakers. Under the flashing lights was 19-year-old Renzo Ren Evangelista, hanging out near the covered court with his cousins. His dad worked construction in Qatar, and his mom was a caregiver in Hong Kong, so Ren was raised by his grandmother. His parents were present mostly through video calls and monthly remittances. Ren was a quiet, low-key guy who worked odd jobs around the neighborhood. Everyone knew him as a polite kid who would do a favor for anyone, but his grandma knew one specific thing. Ren was an incredibly slow eater because large bites made him gag. That detail is honestly so terrifying considering what happened next. That year, the community Christmas party featured a relay race where participants could win grocery packs. I know how fiercely competitive people get over these free groceries. Contestants had to sprint to a table, stuff a whole hard-boiled egg into their mouth, swallow it, and tag the next player. It seemed cheap and harmless. There wasn't a medic on site, just local volunteers. Ren joined at the last second because a team was short a player. By his turn, his group was losing. I can picture him getting caught up in the pressure as he picked up the egg, mashed it with his fingers, and tried to swallow it fast. This is where everything went completely wrong. Instead of chewing, he tried swallowing the large mouthful immediately. The egg broke apart, but several large pieces compressed together into a dense food bolus at the back of his throat. Rather than moving down into his esophagus, the mass shifted over the entrance to his airway and became tightly lodged. For a few seconds, everyone kept laughing because the court was chaotic and loud, but Ren stood frozen, locking both hands around his neck as his face turned dark. His grandma noticed first. I can't even imagine the terror she felt realizing he wasn't playing around. By the time a volunteer pulled him away, nearly 40 seconds had passed. Ren dropped to his knees, fighting for air. A volunteer attempted the Heimlich maneuver. Each push forced out saliva, but the main piece stayed wedged tight. It's a surreal, heartbreaking scene to watch on the footage, the crowd going dead silent while upbeat Christmas music kept blasting. A neighbor pulled his van right up to the court. Tragically, Ren went limp before they could load him into the van. Because the community didn't have an ambulance, emergency responders met them halfway down the road. The hospital was 15 minutes away, but Ren was pronounced dead upon arrival. The medical report listed the cause of death as asphyxia from a food bolus. The egg blocked his windpipe. Investigators noted that the compressed mass of egg created a tight blockage over the windpipe. Even though some fragments broke loose during rescue attempts, the remaining obstruction continued, preventing enough air from reaching the lungs. Following the incident, local officials reviewed safety procedures for future community events, but no criminal charges were filed. What stays with me is that at the wake, neighbors pooled money for the coffin because Ren's parents couldn't make it back in time. Ren's grandmother would carry the weight of that Christmas party forever. But on the other side of the region, a different family was about to receive a phone call no one ever wants. It was June 18th, 2016, over in Busan, South Korea. Even long after sunset, the harbor district was absolutely buzzing with fishing crews and sailors packing into tiny waterfront joints. The humid sea air was thick, tables were jammed, and the phones came out the second someone suggested eating something crazy. Sitting at one of those tables was 34-year-old Rios Santos, a Filipino ship mechanic who spent his days keeping massive cargo vessels running. His crewmates described him as dependable, careful, and the last person to seek trouble. Everything Rios did was for his family. Most of his paycheck went straight to his wife and young son back home, and he spent years saving to bring them to South Korea. And knowing how much he loved them makes this story even harder to hear. Friends said he never stopped talking about his family and used every chance he got to video call them whenever his ship reached port. That night, a bunch of the crew gathered at a local seafood spot right by the docks to celebrate finishing a really rough voyage. Now, one of the big items on the menu there was live baby octopus, which is a pretty well-known delicacy in South Korea, but definitely an acquired taste if you're not from there. They chop the pieces up small, but here's the creepy part, that the nerves stay active for a little bit, so the tentacles are still squirming around on the plate. The restaurant staff always tells people you have to chew it down completely before you even think about swallowing. Once the food hit the table, some of the younger guys immediately started filming videos for social media. At first, Rios wanted absolutely no part of it. He'd never eaten live octopus before and looked pretty uncomfortable with the whole idea. But as the table got louder, a few of his buddies started egging him on. Eventually, he gave in, probably just wanting to be a good sport and not look like a party pooper in front of the crew. Witnesses said Rios picked up a wriggling piece, dipped it in sesame oil, and put it into his mouth. Instead of chewing it thoroughly, he appeared to swallow almost immediately. A few coworkers laughed and cheered while the cameras kept recording. For a moment, nothing seemed wrong. Then Rios suddenly froze. Investigators later reviewed footage showing Rios suddenly grabbing his throat and slamming a fist onto the table. A mass of octopus tissue had become lodged in his airway, while the tentacles and suction cups made it difficult to remove. His face quickly turned red as he struggled to breathe. At first, coworkers thought he was reacting to the texture. Then panic set in. Rios knocked over his chair, stumbled backward, and went silent. A crewmate immediately performed the Heimlich maneuver, but the obstruction remained. Paramedics later restored his pulse, but the lack of oxygen caused severe brain damage. He died the next day. The autopsy confirmed choking from octopus tissue blocking his airway. Afterward, his crewmates raised money to help his wife and son with funeral expenses, while police reviewed the phone footage and ruled the death a tragic accident. The case sparked debate about the dangers of swallowing live octopus without chewing properly. Several restaurants reportedly removed similar eating challenges afterward. Rios never made it home to the family he worked so hard to support, but thousands of miles away in Japan, another ordinary contest was about to turn deadly for a retired delivery driver. It was January 3rd, 2018, in Yokohama, Japan. A cold rain had come down overnight, leaving the sidewalks damp and gray. The New Year's celebrations were winding down, but local community centers were still buzzing with holiday events. Nobody knew how fast things would fall apart on this quiet afternoon. In the middle of the holiday crowd was 58-year-old Teijo Moriwaki, who had arrived with his wife. After more than 30 years as a delivery driver, he had finally retired. Friends described him as dependable and stubborn. Following his wife's stroke 4 years earlier, much of his retirement was spent caring for her. It's hard to see how tight money was for them. Medical bills had slowly eaten away at their savings, so Teijo was always looking for ways to stretch a dollar. The New Year's event had some decent prizes up for grabs, like a grocery voucher and a portable space heater. To a guy like Teijo, those weren't just fun little prizes, and they were practical necessities. The main attraction was a mochi eating contest. Contestants raced to swallow large pieces of freshly made mochi while the crowd cheered. Organizers reminded everyone to chew carefully, but speed was the whole point. Health officials had long warned that mochi is a serious choking hazard, especially for seniors. Some volunteers suggested smaller portions, but organizers kept the traditional serving sizes. At first, everything seemed totally fine. Teijo knocked back the first few portions with no problem at all. A video caught by a spectator showed him chewing away while the crowd counted, along with every swallow. But by the time he got to the third massive piece, you could tell his movements were getting slower and a lot more forced. Suddenly, Teijo pushed himself back from the table. The footage is honestly so tough to watch. His eyes go wide, he stands halfway up, and he grips the table for dear life while his other hand flies right to his throat. At first, the crowd thought he was just coughing. Even his wife stayed seated, and I bet she was just thinking he needed a quick sip of water. But within seconds, it's painfully obvious that something is horribly wrong. Teijo couldn't make a single sound. His face turned from bright red to a scary bluish purple as he desperately tried to catch his breath. A volunteer rushed up and started pumping his stomach with abdominal thrusts, while another tried reaching right into his mouth. But the thing about mochi, and this part really creeps me out, is that you just can't get a grip on it. The rice cake had basically formed this dense, incredibly sticky mass deep inside his airway. Unlike bread, which would crumble, this stuff wasn't moving. For me, the worst part of the video is seeing Teijo collapse onto his knees. While bystanders called 911, others desperately tried first aid. It took paramedics about 8 minutes to get to the scene. By the time responders arrived, Teijo was unconscious and no longer breathing. They cleared part of the blockage, and doctors later removed a large wad of compressed mochi from his throat. But he had gone too long without oxygen and was pronounced dead that evening. The autopsy confirmed that the rice cake had completely blocked his airway, causing suffocation. Officials found no criminal wrongdoing, but organizers canceled future mochi speed eating contests and began serving smaller portions. In the months that followed, Teijo's wife donated his unused prize voucher to a local senior center. The staff started cutting mochi into bite-sized pieces and posted choking warnings during New Year celebrations, a small but lasting change that came from his tragedy.